In the early 19th century, the relentless quest to map and understand the human body often began in a graveyard. Edinburgh, Scotland, was a powerhouse for medical education, but teaching thousands of young surgeons required a staggering amount of raw material, fresh human corpses. This graph tracks the core of the crisis. The red line shows surging medical demand for fresh corpses, but legally, surgeons could only dissect executed murderers. The blue line shows that legal supply flatlining, creating a massive gap between medical needs and legal availability. That void spawned a desperate, unregulated black market. Respected anatomists needed supply so badly, they stopped asking where the bodies came from. The supply chains for this illicit trade snaked through the darkest corners of 1828 Edinburgh. The city was crowded, filthy, and plagued by deep poverty. The first opportunists to step into this market were the Resurrection Men. These were gangs of grave robbers who prowled the cemeteries at night, digging up freshly buried citizens to sell to the universities. But exhuming bodies was an unreliable business model. It required backbreaking labor in the freezing cold, carried heavy legal risks, and the merchandise was decomposing by the time it reached the table. The sheer inefficiency of grave robbing meant the market was struggling to scale. It was a failure of supply that invited a far more ruthless solution. Enter William Burke and William Hare. They were impoverished laborers, barely scraping by, operating a dingy, cheap boarding house far from the elite lecture halls of the medical schools. One winter day, an elderly tenant died in his room of natural causes. He left behind a small debt of a few pounds in unpaid rent. To recoup the loss, the two men stripped the old man's bed, packed his body tightly into a wooden tea chest, and hauled him through the alleys to the doorstep of Dr. Robert Knox. This diagram illustrates the economic shock of what happened next. To settle a debt worth a handful of copper coins, Dr. Knox handed Burke and Hare 7 pounds and 10 shillings, the equivalent of months of hard labor, without a single question. That single payment was more than they could earn in months of honest work. From that moment on, every tenant in the house represented a massive potential payout. Rather than waiting for more tenants to die naturally, they decided to manufacture their own supply. They targeted the vulnerable, the homeless wanderers and sick travelers, luring them back to the boarding house and plying them with excessive amounts of whiskey. But the doctors had strict quality control standards. Anatomists would reject a corpse if it showed obvious signs of violence, like stab wounds or broken bones. One man pinned the victim down, while the other covered their mouth and nose until the victim suffocated. This technique was repeated with industrial precision. Over a span of just 10 months, they successfully processed and delivered 16 pristine corpses. By removing the forensic traces of violence, they had perfected the delivery of fresh, high-quality bodies. The boarding house had become a reliable supplier for the anatomy schools. But operating at that volume breeds complacency. After killing their final victim, a woman named Margaret Daugherty, Burke carelessly hid her body under a pile of straw in the spare room. The poor concealment caught the attention of another couple staying in the house. The moment Burke and Hare left, the tenants dug through the straw, found the lifeless body, and immediately summoned the police. The investigation moved swiftly. Police traced the remains from the squalor of the boarding house to the sterile, brightly lit dissection table of Dr. Knox. That raid shattered the invisible wall between the city's poorest alleys and its wealthiest academies. The terrified citizens of Edinburgh realized the esteemed medical establishment was directly financing mass murder. In the ensuing legal fallout, loyalty vanished. Hare turned state's evidence to secure his own immunity, leaving Burke to face the gallows alone. William Burke was hanged in the city square before a massive, roaring crowd of 25,000 spectators. But his punishment did not end at death. By order of the judge, Burke's corpse was handed over to the very same medical students he once supplied, to be publicly and thoroughly dissected. It leaves us with a deeply unsettling reality. Every time we walk into a modern hospital, we benefit from a foundation of anatomical knowledge that was built, in part, on an economy of innocent blood.